We just heard from Gary Neville. I think you were listening into the interview. I just want to read what he said to you in full about Labour abstaining on that vote on COVID restriction tiers. He said, when you're elected and you're in that seat in Westminster, you take a position, you don't abstain, you take part in the match. You're the opposition, don't sit in the stand. He's right, isn't he? Labour did sit on the stand.
No, I respectfully disagree with that analysis. We didn't sit in the stands at all. What we did was to act in the national interest. We accepted, first of all, that there should be restrictions. That's why we didn't oppose them. But at the same time, there were still issues. So, for example, there wasn't that comprehensive health and indeed economic strategy alongside the restrictions. There wasn't that communication strategy. There wasn't the strategy, the effective strategy we need around test, track and isolate. And there were substantial gaps in the economic package. So in that situation, the appropriate thing to do was not to block the restrictions altogether. That wouldn't have been in the national interest. But they weren't at a level where we could give them our wholehearted support. And that's why we took the decision to abstain. It turned out to be a very important decision because it seemed in the numbers that there were sufficient numbers of Conservative MPs rebelling that the Prime Minister has frankly lost control of that would have created a significant issue.
You see, this is what I don't understand. You say that you were happy that the legislation went through because otherwise there wouldn't be the restrictions in place. So why don't you just vote for it? Some might say that you're trying to have your cake and eat it here. You want the restrictions to go through, you effectively support them despite your doubts, but you also perhaps want to reserve the right to criticise the government if it all goes wrong.
Well, no, we also want to put pressure on the government at the same time to improve what is on the table. And let me just take that example of the economic package, which clearly has been a significant problem. For example, you have a situation where businesses are getting, as it were, one-off help. It doesn't reflect the period that areas of the country are actually under restrictions. Take areas of the north have been under restrictions for a significantly longer period than other parts of the country. In addition to that, we want more certainty around the furlough scheme. It's good that it was extended, albeit at the 11th hour, but we still have this threat of changes to the scheme in January. There are also many people who've been excluded from help, particularly the self-employed. So we accept the need for restrictions, but we still are pushing for improvements because the package, particularly the economic package put forward by the government, simply doesn't match the ambition of the moment.
So you abstained on the COVID restrictions. Are you going to abstain if there's a Brexit trade deal vote as well?
Well, on the issue of the Brexit trade deal and potential trade deal, my first message is this. We absolutely need to get a deal. We all know what the consequences of no deal would be for the country, both in terms of jobs and livelihoods all across the United Kingdom, but also in terms of that security partnership that we need for access to databases and the operation of international warrants that allow us to keep our people safe. So absolutely, first of all, we need to get a deal, and that's the strong message. In terms of our position on any deal, clearly we need to see what has been agreed. I think that's a sensible, responsible position to take. But let's very much, we hope there is a deal, because there seem to be two paths before us at the moment. A path of leaving the transition period without a deal and leaving with a deal. And we do know how catastrophic the no deal outcome would be.
So if a no deal would be catastrophic, in your words, and that the UK absolutely needs to get a deal, surely the logical conclusion is that Labour is going to vote for a deal.
Well, I think there's 2 points there. I think, first of all, it's the responsible thing to actually consider the deal that is actually agreed. But in addition to that, we don't know at the moment what's actually going to be presented to Parliament. Will it be the deal as agreed? Will it be a piece of legislation that is actually giving effect to that deal in legal terms? And we'll have to consider that as well. So those are the questions that we will, as an opposition, be considering. And in considering those, we will be putting the national interest first and bearing in mind how important it is that we do actually find a way now of leaving with a deal. No deal would be catastrophic at any moment, but it is particularly the case as we go through this global pandemic.
Listening to your answer, it's, on the one hand, on the other hand, it feels to me like abstaining is on the table still.
Well, look, it's a question of, first of all, the government, we want to get a deal. That is crucially important, and that's why it's been extremely concerning. We want all parties around the table to reach that deal. That's the first important, crucial step.
But the responsible on abstaining, is abstaining on the table still?
Well, look, what I'm saying in terms of this, Sophie, is of course there are various options. When you get any particular vote that you get before Parliament, there are the options that there always are. That's absolutely the case. But what I'm saying is that the responsible thing to this is, first of all, emphasising the need to get a deal, but then to consider what has been agreed, but also to consider what's actually going to be put before Parliament. It may not be a straight vote on the deal. It may actually be that time is running out so much now that actually all we'll get is an actual piece of legislation putting that deal into effect, which of course we would look at in the way we would look at any piece of legislation.
I absolutely understand that, of course, you need to see the legislation. But there is a bit of a serious point here. We know there are incredibly difficult decisions on COVID, on Brexit. We know that there's arguments on both sides. But that is why we elect politicians, to make those difficult decisions. You've abstained on COVID. It sounds like you might abstain on Brexit as well.
Well, look, we consider each particular circumstance, and I've explained why we took the approach that we did on the COVID restrictions that were put before Parliament. We will now look at the issue of a Brexit deal if one is agreed, putting the national interest first, which is absolutely what a responsible opposition should do. We will then consider, as I say, what has been agreed. We'll then have to consider, in addition, the form in which it is put to Parliament and what we're actually being asked to do. And ensuring as well, by the way, that whatever scenario there is on the 31st of December, that the government has actually prepared for that. And that's something we've been pushing in recent months and will continue to push the government on as well.
OK. Now I'm keen to ask you, while I've got you, about one other story in the newspapers this weekend. The government's trying to deport up to 50 Jamaican nationals. Some of them came here as children, some of them have family here, but they have subsequently committed crimes in the United Kingdom. Is it right that convicted criminals born overseas should be deported?
Well, look, Labour will always act in the national interest, and if there are people who are convicted of very serious crimes who've lost their right to remain, then yes, they should be deported. But the point that we were raising with regard to that particular flight was deep concern around the Windrush scandal and continuing injustice, where, of course, people have been deported who shouldn't have been in the past. And that's why we put forward, as a Labour front bench, very serious questions of the government on the work that they had done on this flight. For example, we put issues of someone on the flight having a grandfather from the Windrush generation, a great aunt who may even have been on the actual Empire Windrush. So asking those questions was extremely important, and indeed we seem to have been vindicated in asking those questions when it does appear that significant numbers of people originally meant to go on that flight did not in the event leave on it.
You bring up Windrush and compare this to Windrush. I just wonder, do you think some people might see that as a bit insulting, to compare, the deportation of criminals, including rapists, to the attempted deportation of the Windrush generation? It didn't commit crimes. They came here to the UK decades ago to work and to try and rebuild the economy after the war.
I don't think that at all. There's an issue as to whether or not there were people on the flight who had eligibility for the Windrush scheme. But on the broader issue of the Windrush generation, the government is piling injustice upon injustice. We've had the promise that the 30 recommendations in the Wendy Williams Lessons Learned review from March are going to actually be implemented. Not one of them has been implemented. And the Windrush compensation scheme is frankly an offensive mess. A scheme that was expected to run into the value of hundreds of millions of pounds. We were told last week it's paid out to 226 people and around about £2.1 million. Now, of course, I'm pleased that those 226 people have received at least some compensation for the terrible injustice they've suffered. But that is a tiny, tiny fraction of the overall scale of this injustice. That scheme is unsurprisingly losing confidence, and the government desperately needs to get a grip of it.